Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel on designing and building ML systems. My name is Manoranjan Pradhan. In this week's video, we'll discuss about another technique in dealing with data labeling challenges called weak supervision or labeling functions. Majority of the problems that you'll be dealing with in industry are supervised learning problems. And one of the key input for this kind of problems is a label data. Some label data are natural labels. That means they're actually generated by the systems or business processes and captured and can be leveraged to train models. But in certain problem domain, these labels are not available and has to be manually created. These are called hand labels, and typically it's very time consuming and very expensive to generate those labels. And we discussed one of the technique called active learning in one of the previous video, which helps to identify the most valuable samples or examples to label, which reduces the total time or effort taken to label the data. But besides active learning, there is also another technique called programmatic labels. We can actually write programs to generate labels. This is called weak supervision. The weak supervision is actually based on a concept called noisy labels, vis-a-vis the strong labels which are created by the human labelers. Of course, they would be subject matter experts, so they will go through each sample and example very carefully and understand which class it belongs to and hence label them. And those labels are mostly accurate. But one of the challenges that we already discussed is they're very time consuming and very expensive to create. You don't have to really create very accurate or strong labels. You can also create lot of less accurate labels, which are called noisy labels, which are incomplete or less accurate. These labels are not created by human labelers, but small programs or functions which can be developed based on some heuristics. The accuracy of those labels may not be as good as what a human labeler would have created. And these are also called programmatic labels. So let's look at an example to understand a little better. So let's take a simple example. The credit for this example goes to www.snorkel.org, and I have taken this example to explain this concept of weak supervision. So there are YouTube messages or feedbacks, and we want to build a classification model to classify if those feedbacks are a spam or not a spam. And of course, we're going to first create the label data set. To create that, we're not going to use manual labeler, but rather we'll try to use the approach of weak supervision. So to do that, we will have some heuristics or some understanding about what is a spam message and what is not a spam message. Let's say if there is a word called subscribe in the message, probably it is a spam. Not very deterministically, maybe probabilistically. And if the message contains a word called checkout, it can also be a spam message. Similarly, if it contains an external HTTP link, they want to again divert your attention, it might be a spam. Again, with not so accurate, but it's possible that it can be a spam message. And if the feedback contains a person's name, maybe it is not a spam. We probably have 10 or 20 or 30 different heuristics or basic understanding or logic about what can be a spam or not a spam message. And around each of them, you can actually write a small function to do that. programmatically, and these are called labeling functions. And now collectively apply all the labeling functions to each of the feedbacks and messages and try to understand what those labeling functions collectively are saying. So how do we create these labeling functions? We can create these labeling functions using a simple programming approach. Let's say there are certain heuristics which says if the message contains a word called subscribe or check or HTTP link, it is a spam message. So you can actually go and write a small function which can use regular expressions to search for a particular pattern in the message and then say it may be a spam or not a spam based on the pattern found. It can also be, let's say, another heuristics which says if the message contains a person's name, then probably it is not a spam. But how do I find if the message contains a person's name or not? In this case, you can actually apply a pre-trained model, like a pre-trained NER model. So here we are not applying a simple programming approach, but we are actually applying a third-party model to extract certain information from the message, and based on that, we are saying it may be a spam or not a spam, and find out if the message contains a person's name. Similarly, you can also, let's say, another heuristic which says the message is opinionated, or if the message has a very strong sentiment, positive or negative, then again probably it is not a spam. It's talking about the actual video. The spam messages are typically not opinionated and not a very strong sentiment, very weak sentiment. That's, let's say, the assumption or the heuristic. Then we can apply a classification model, an existing pre-trained classification model, like a sentiment classification model. And you can find out the subjectivity, which says whether it's opinionated or not opinionated, or a sentiment score, which again says how strong and how weak the sentiments are. And then all this we can write as a separate labeling functions like LF1, LF2, LF3, LF4, LF5, or probably some more, a set of labeling functions which we can then collectively apply on each of the message. Now we can apply all these labeling functions on the individual samples on the unlabeled data sets, where each labeling function will label the samples based on the heuristics that we have programmed into it. The labeling functions can either label them as a spam or not a spam, or you can also abstain from labeling, because if the labeling function does not find sufficient evidence to label them either a spam or not a spam, it can say I will abstain from labeling it. And then we'll create something called a label matrix. So this is the label matrix. And from this label matrix, we can finally predict or finally create the final labels. So there are two approaches. One is we take a majority vote of labeling functions. So let's say in this sample, we have three labeling functions which are saying it's a spam. So we'll label them as a spam message. And here the majority of them are saying it's not a spam. So we will label them as a not a spam message. And wherever the most of the labeling functions are abstaining, we can actually not label it. It's wrongly labeled as 0, we cannot label it. So this particular sample will not be taken as a label data point for the training set. We will ignore this for the time. And these are primarily noise labels. They may be accurate or they may not be accurate. But there's another approach It's called a generative model. We can actually use a model here, a generative model, to predict these labels. So this model can predict these final labels by learning to estimate the accuracy and correlation of the labeling functions based on their agreements and disagreements. So this is of course most widely used approach to create the noisy labels. It's empirically found that if you have more number of labeling functions and more number of labeled data points, typically it leads to a better model. There are many case studies where it is empirically found that the accuracy obtained from using labels generated through weak supervision, like a labeling functions, has almost similar accuracy compared to labels created using hand labels. But the effort required to create those labels through labeling functions are significantly lower. So in this case study, there was an image classification problem of chest radiographs to classify them as either normal or abnormal. And you can read in this paper, I will provide the link in the description section. A radiology fellow wrote 20 labeling functions in under 8 hours of cumulative clinician time. And they were actually implemented using Python with several hours of assistance from a computer science graduate student. And those labeling functions which run against about 50,000 data points. And you can see the, the blue line indicates the labeling functions and the black line indicates the fully supervised, which are manual labels created. And you can see when we generate about 50,000 labels, the accuracy obtained from both the approach is pretty similar, and both of them have an average AUC of more than 0.9. But to generate those labels using labeling functions took only few hours, whereas generate those manual labels took several months or years. So in another section in the paper, it shows our results show this approach which can enable clinicians to rapidly generate large training set in a matter of days, which match or exceed the performance of large hand labeled training sets that took months or years of physician time to annotate. So how do we create labeling functions? We have to use a framework which can actually help you to write those labeling functions, apply them across all samples, build a generative model to create the final noisy labels. So one of the most widely used framework is called Snorkel for creating programmatic labels. In fact, Snorkel is the organization which initially proposed this idea of labeling functions in one of the papers. In this week's video, we discuss about a technique called weak supervision to deal with data labeling challenges. So thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next video with a new topic. Thank you.